Far Cry 2 is a game that's been held up as an example of what open world sandbox games can be like, and in fact, should be like by a lot of people, myself included in other videos on this very channel. But how does that game actually hold up now? Memories and nostalgia are one thing, but how does Far Cry 2 actually still hold up? Is it still the shining example of open world perfection that I've revered it as? When you first start playing the game, you'll probably think all of us Far Cry 2 zealots have completely lost our mind. The game doesn't necessarily make a particularly great first impression by front-loading a ton of dialogue delivered with terrible voice acting and introducing you to a villain that you somehow don't give a shit about immediately. But once you're done with that terrible introductory sequence, you'll be introduced to the first thing that makes this game awesome: the map, which is a physical item you have to bring up into your character's field of view in order to look at. No cheating out to a menu or looking at a compass in the upper right of your screen. You need to distract yourself, and that can lead to serious problems in playing. There is a GPS that's affixed to the dashboard in the cars you drive, but the important thing is that there's no arrow showing you exactly where to go. You can see what the roads look like and the map is marked, but you need to figure out which route you want to take. The second major mechanic that the game introduces is gun jamming. Guns picked up off enemies are basically trash. They'll constantly jam on you and really fuck you over in intense firefights. But as you collect more of the diamonds that are scattered around the world as collectibles, you'll be able to buy guns that don't jam because they're brand new. While this is certainly an annoying mechanic, it works in a few ways. It allows you to pick up weapons in an emergency and use them, but not permanently. You'll always be forced back to weapons that you own, which forces you to engage with the game's side missions in order to unlock new guns, and also forces you to kind of change up your arsenal every once in a while. After introducing you to a few more intricacies of the world, you're basically dumped into the sandbox. And I'm not using sandbox in the way some games like to do either. Far Cry 2 does a pretty good job of teaching you how the systems in the game work before dumping you out into the world, and it's always got something that can direct you towards doing the next thing. You'll never feel lacking in things you can do at all. In that way, Far Cry 2 isn't really a sandbox in, say, the Minecraft sense. It gives you objectives to achieve, and it really clearly lays out what those objectives are. But it lets you achieve those objectives in any way you please. The game's objectives are deliberately vague. You'll be tasked with killing someone, given the details on who they are and where they are, and that's it. If you can find a way to deal with them outside of what the developers thought of, more power to you. The game's not going to stop you. In fact, it practically encourages it in a lot of cases, with wide open areas that can be approached from a ton of different directions. NPCs will often give you tips on ways to approach missions, but if you want to ignore them, you are completely free to do so. A lot of modern games have this tendency to be an open world sandbox only when it suits them. I'm going to harp on Rockstar a bit, but they're far from the only company that does this sort of thing. If I'm walking around in Red Dead 2 and I decide to take on a mission, I am then basically put on rails. If I deviate from the path in any tiny way once I'm in that mission, if I do anything the game doesn't expect me to do, the mission will almost certainly fail, and I'll be forced to do it again. Far Cry 2 has zero interest in these sorts of restraints, and I believe that is why it's so loved. And that's not to say Far Cry 2 is afraid of letting you hit a fail state. If you want to walk into a town that's under a ceasefire and start shooting up the place, you can go right ahead. You'll die almost immediately, but the important thing is, the game lets you do it. A lesser game would just prevent you from shooting in the first place, because they don't want you to have a bad experience with their focus-tested to death game. But speaking of bad experiences, we have to talk about the elephant in the room with this game, the most infamous element of it: malaria. The one mechanic does more damage to this game than anything else, and that's because it infringes somewhat on the freedom that I've been speaking to this entire time. To put it quite bluntly, at a defined interval, you'll have a malaria attack, and every time you do, you need to pop a pill, a resource that you have a finite amount of until you run specific side missions. So basically, you're forced to do this series of side missions. And being forced to do anything is absolute poison for a sandbox like this. For me, it ended up not being that huge of a deal, but that's going to vary depending on how much you like or dislike the side missions you're being forced to do. In an ideal world, you'd be able to completely ignore these side missions, acquire malaria pills some other way, but you just can't. And it's frankly a stain on the open world sandbox nature of this game. Still, I think this game remains as a paragon of open world sandbox values. Even all these years later, I think Far Cry 2 remains extremely playable, and an excellent example of how to build a game like this. I feel like modern games could learn a whole hell of a lot from Far Cry 2, and it's clear that some games certainly have, but I would argue they haven't learned some of the most important lessons this game has to teach regarding player freedom. I will grant you that giving the player more freedom comes at the cost of a good or even viable narrative at times, but if that's the price to pay, I am fully willing to pay it. In my retro reviews, I look at games that have come out at least 10 years ago and see if they've held up, if they're still worth playing now. If you like that idea, be sure to subscribe so you can see the latest videos. If you like this video in particular, be sure to hit that like button, and thanks for watching.